Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
We've got quite a mix today, aiming to give you that clearer picture. We're looking at news articles, some YouTube commentary, and even a bit on the U.S. Federal Reserve.
Yeah, a real mix. And today we're diving into something I know a lot of you are keeping tabs on, these ongoing trade tensions, specifically the tariffs and all the economic stuff that ripples out from them.
Right. Our mission, really, is to help you cut through all that noise, pinpoint what's actually important, maybe uncover a few surprises, and definitely avoid that feeling of information overload.
Exactly. Brain scramble avoidance is key. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So first up, how's China actually reacting to these latest U.S. tariff hikes?
Okay, yeah, the first thing I saw was this talk about China maybe restricting Hollywood movies, as a counterpunch.
Ah, the movie angle. And Trump's response?
Apparently I've heard worse things. Pretty standard, right? Never misses a beat. But the interesting question is, will this movie thing actually pack a punch financially?
Good point. What's the thinking there?
Well, the analysis we looked at suggests maybe not as much as you'd think. Hollywood's box office in China was already kind of softening, apparently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the studios get a much smaller slice of the pie there compared to other places, like maybe 25% versus 50% or more elsewhere. So it's symbolic, sure, but the actual financial hit may be less severe.
So more of a statement than a knockout blow. Okay, but what about on the ground? How are regular people in China reacting? I saw something about social media.
Oh, yeah, this is where it gets pretty creative. Chinese social media users are definitely weighing in, and memes seem to be a weapon of choice against the U.S. tariffs.
Memes? Like what?
Well, one example mentioned was apparently a meme of a heavier set Trump in a skirt dancing with Elon Musk.
Wait, what? Seriously?
That's what the source said. Quite the image, huh? And there were others, like showing Trump looking incompetent trying to assemble stuff on a production line.
Okay, so they're using humor and maybe hitting back at stereotypes, kind of highlighting their own manufacturing prowess.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
It's maybe a way to downplay the threat a bit, boost morale, And that national pride seems to be spilling over into shopping habits, too.
How so?
There's apparently a noticeable shift. People moving away from brands like, say, iPhone and Tesla, and opting for domestic ones instead, like Xiaomi or BYD.
Ah, the bi-national effect. That makes sense, especially with trade tensions high.
Definitely. And it seems this sentiment is being, amplified by domestic propaganda. They're bringing up this idea of the century of national humiliation.
Okay, unpack that a bit. What's the connection they're drawing?
It refers back to that period like mid-19th to mid-20th century with foreign influence and unequal treaties. The narrative being pushed is that this trade war is just another example of outsiders trying to bully China, something they need to stand up against together.
So they're framing the current tariffs as part of this long historical struggle against foreign powers, using past grievances to rally people now.
That's the analysis, yeah. The argument is that Trump's really assertive style, instead of maybe intimidating Beijing, might actually be handing Xi Jinping propaganda fuel on a silver platter.
Huh. So the tough stance could actually be strengthening Xi's position internally.
It's a possibility raised by the sources. It suggests that what's intended as economic leverage might be unintentionally boosting this nationalist narrative, making a long-term solution potentially harder, not easier.
Wow, that's a really interesting dynamic. Economic pressure having unintended political consequences. Okay, let's shift gears. What about the view from inside the U.S. economy, specifically the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, crucial piece for you, the listener, to grasp the potential impact stateside. And one key thing our Fed source stresses. These decisions, they aren't just Powell waking up and deciding things. It's a committee. Votes are needed.
Right. Not a one-man show. So what are the big factors weighing on their minds right now with these tariffs in play?
Okay, several things are tangled up here. First, Powell himself, back on April 16th, acknowledged that these new Trump tariffs, they'll probably push inflation up and likely hurt economic growth.
That sounds like a classic central bank nightmare, the old inflation versus growth trade-off.
Exactly. It puts the Fed in a really tough spot trying to balance keeping prices stable with keeping employment high, like you said, a real bind.
So do they raise rates to fight the inflation, risking the slowdown, or hold off and risk prices getting out of hand? Oof.
And complicating it even more is the uncertainty about how long these tariffs will even last. They were announced for 90 days initially, right? But who knows?
Yeah, that makes planning tricky.
Incredibly tricky. How do you set policy when you don't know if the main issue will vanish in 3 months or stick around. They're flying a bit blind on that front.
Trying to predict the future based on, well, guesswork, almost.
Pretty much. And the source suggests that while, yeah, full employment is always important, the main focus right now seems to be squarely on keeping inflation under control.
Okay, so inflation is the top worry. A bit of a shift maybe from earlier talk about emergency cuts if tariffs happened.
It seems that way. The emphasis now is definitely on the price stability side of their mandate. The key thing for you is realizing the Fed's primary concern seems to have shifted towards the inflation risk from tariffs.
Got it. What else is making their job difficult?
Well, just the general economic picture is pretty fuzzy, partly because Trump's policies can be unpredictable. There's been a lot of back and forth in forecasts about whether the U.S. might hit a recession in the next year or so.
Yeah, the recession predictions have been all over the place.
Totally. And then there's this weird disconnect in the data. Recent inflation numbers, like the CPI and PPI, what consumers pay and what businesses get paid, they've been kind of low. But ask consumers. Their expectations for future inflation are still pretty high.
Huh. So the official numbers say one thing, but people feel like prices are going to keep rising.
Exactly. That gap is something the Fed has to puzzle over. What do you react to? The current data or the future expectation?
Tricky. And isn't there always that lag effect with monetary policy?
Absolutely. You turn the steering wheel now, but the ship doesn't actually change course for months. They have to act based on where they think the economy will be, not where it is today. That makes timing everything incredibly difficult.
Okay, so given all this fog of uncertainty, where does Powell actually stand right now? What's the official line?
The current take seems to be that the benchmark interest rate, 4.25 to 4.5%, is considered moderately restrictive.
Moderately restrictive, meaning they think it's tapping the brakes gently, but not slamming them on?
That's the idea. Slow things down enough to curb inflation, hopefully without causing a recession. Powell's signaling they'll be patient, flexible, watch the data, basically keeping their options open. No strong promises either way.
Sounds like standard central banker talk. What about the stock market? It's been jumpy. Does the Fed care?
Powell's view, according to the source, is basically unless the market's volatility starts causing real problems with liquidity, meaning money isn't flowing properly, then the day-to-day ups and downs of stocks aren't their main concern.
So don't expect the Fed to ride to the rescue just because the Dow drops a bit.
Pretty much. They're focused on the broader economy, not just stock prices.
Okay. And rate cuts. Everyone seems to be expecting them eventually.
Yeah, the market is definitely pricing in cuts down the line. But when and how much? That's where the uncertainty really kicks in, mirroring the Fed's own uncertainty,
Makes sense. So the Fed's caught, right? Do they maybe hike rates now because they fear tariff inflation will stick? Or do they hold back, thinking the tariffs might just be a short-term bargaining chip?
That's the dilemma. And all that uncertainty, yeah, it definitely weighs on the stock market. Investors hate uncertainty.
Okay, let's widen the lens again. How are other big players reacting? Japan, for instance. Their reaction sounds quite different from China's.
Yeah, it really does offer a contrast. We got some insights from comments by Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba.
And what's his take? Is Japan just bracing for impact?
Not exactly just bracing. Ishiba's remarks suggested a sense that the U.S. has, quote, finally woken up to some global shifts. But he immediately followed that by asking, okay, as an ally, what can Japan actually do for the U.S. now?
Interesting. So not just about taking direction, but about defining their role.
Exactly. He stressed that any talks about tariffs wouldn't just be about giving the U.S. what it wants. Japan has its own national interests, its own core concerns to protect.
So looking out for number one while still being an ally. A balancing act.
Precisely. Ishiba talked about this fundamental change in the world since the Cold War ended and China rose. It impacts everything, economy, security. He noted the U.S. used to be this kind of protector for allies like Japan, and that role benefited the U.S. too. But now, well, Trump is questioning that whole setup.
So Ishiba sees the old rules of the alliance might be changing.
That's the implication. He's suggesting Japan needs to think proactively, like, what can we bring to the table in this alliance, especially regarding China? What's our role? What's the U.S. role globally?
More of a strategic rethink, less just following along.
Seems to be the message. He even mentions setting up an all-Japan task force, different ministries working together to figure out the challenges and craft a response. That includes understanding the hit to their own companies, too.
Sounds serious, a coordinated national approach.
Very much so. He acknowledged the long alliance, the existing trade deals, but also voiced serious concerns about more tariffs. They value the relationship, but they're clearly worried about the economic fallout.
Okay, so Japan. Navigating the alliance, worried about tariffs, trying to figure out its future role. What about Taiwan? There was a quick mention there, too.
Yeah, just briefly. It seems Taiwan is facing similar pressures. Reports suggest the opposition party there is pushing for a strong government line to protect Taiwanese industries.
So same theme again, balancing national economic interests against these big global trade fights. Even smaller players feel the squeeze.
Absolutely. It really shows how widespread the impact is. Everyone's trying to find their footing in this shifting landscape.
Okay, let's pull in some final thoughts, maybe perspectives we haven't hit hard yet.
Sure. There was that interesting, maybe provocative take from one of the video sources suggesting China could actually end up being the biggest winner in all this.
Winner. How does that work when they're the target of the tariffs?
The argument was about the potential damage to America's international relationships. The idea is if the U.S. gets too aggressive with tariffs, it might push allies away, creating openings for China to increase its influence, maybe in places like Africa or the Middle East.
So the U.S. wins the battle with China directly, but maybe loses the war for global influence. That's the theory.
That's the gist of it. The source also argued that, yeah, tariffs bring some money to the U.S. Treasury, but they could hurt American consumers and businesses more through higher prices and messed up supply chains.
The classic tariff blowback argument.
Right. And it touched on the idea of the U.S. as this huge buyer, sort of labeling China an abuser in trade, framing that as potentially one-sided.
Okay. And the scale of the economic damage, any consensus there?
Not really. Views are all over the map. Some analysts mentioned we're talking huge numbers, like potential damage to the U.S. in the tens of trillions of dollars. But others stress how resilient the Chinese economy has shown itself to be.
So dire warnings on one side, confidence and resilience on the other. No clear answer yet.
Definitely not. It's just incredibly complex and changing fast. You've got the U.S. raising tariffs, China hitting back with economic moves, cultural ones, propaganda. You've got the Fed trying to navigate the economic fallout, Japan doing its balancing act, Taiwan feeling the pressure. The long-term outcome, who wins? Still very much up in the air.
Well, that wraps up another deep dive. Hopefully, breaking down all those different pieces you sent us has given you, our listener, a better handle on this whole tangled trade situation.
Yeah, it really highlights how connected everything is globally, doesn't it? From government policies down to, well, memes and what phone people buy.
Totally. And maybe a final thought for you to ponder. Thinking about everything we've covered, what do you reckon will be the single biggest long-term impact of all these trade tensions on the world economy and how countries relate to each other? Definitely something to think about.
For sure. And hey, speaking of things to chew on, our friend Micky over at Mickytolife on YouTube, he just put up a video about his crazy Demon King version of Taiwanese oyster vermicelli.
Oh man, don't start. That sounds amazing right now. You know, sometimes a great bowl of noodles is exactly what you need to, like, reset your brain after trying to figure out global trade policy.
Maybe that's the secret.
Could be. Anyway, check out Micky's channel. Maybe find some comfort food. For us, that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging.